Jerome, on the way thinking about this way to overcome prejudice for emerging markets, one of the things was maybe to reform the international monetary fund. Again, at the spring meeting 2 weeks ago in Washington, the US failed, in fact, to ratify the governance reform that was adopted in Singapore in 2010. And now you see again here a sense of frustrations from emerging markets that all over again, we're not going to change the governance. We have to wait for the US. Do you think that the Bretton Woods institutions are going to be relevant the next decade unless we change the governance reform, the decision-making power? And maybe there is maybe a new alternative that the fact these countries might want to create their own institutions. We are seeing maybe a more commitment about the BRIC Development Bank. We are seeing, the swap line between the China Central Bank and a lot of emerging markets. We are seeing also some Chinese proposal to create an Asian infrastructure bank. So is it maybe an alternative? And is there maybe that also we are seeing maybe a regional financial architecture emerging, that maybe the institution like the IMF, the World Bank will be less influential in the next 10 years, and we might see now a set of institutions that will be created by the emerging world. That will be also a way to overcome prejudice unless we are able to change the financial architecture at the global level. And the other, I think, game changer that might happen, and you mentioned that in your book when thinking about the international monetary system, will be when the renminbi will become an international currency. And we see that creditor countries matters. We are seeing, when the US become, a major, the dollar become an international currency, what it will change, in thinking about the emerging market where we're going to have a more multipolar world in terms of currencies. How, maybe the prejudice, will be reduced also. So I would like to have you take on really the global financial architecture moving forward.
Well, I think, I remember I did some economic research in Brazil in 1984 in a little village, and there was lots of lobbying for the building of a school, and the local Don said no, he said no, and then of course someone came up from Sao Paulo and built a school. Immediately he built his own school. And I see very much the creation, the initiatives, particularly in Asia, as not only being very much happening and very much predictable, but I see them also as the stimulus to the IMF and to the developed world. And I think the developed world is very aware of what's going on, but they just want to cling on to power a little bit longer. And it's very difficult for them to dissociate themselves from an architecture that they, or to reform an architecture that they dominate. You combine that with hubris and the lack of obvious threat. So to change the architecture, I think you need an impulse. And I think the impulse may come from competitor institutions, which I think are likely to grow. It may come from crisis. One possible scenario, of course, is that the IMF never regains the global presence it had. But it could become, it could change its, as institutions do, change its remit. And of course, in the sense, it's already started to do that because it's become a lender for Europe. Maybe not wittingly, maybe not through choice, but it's become a lender for the debt-ridden developed world rather than the emerging world today. And remember, before this crisis, the IMF was shedding jobs. It was concerned. It had, most of its lending out to one country, Turkey, at the time. There was a real sense that its purpose was waning. Beyond that, I think the IMF potentially remains the most important international institution of all, but only if it can recapture the ground of dominating and becoming really important in the debate on an international monetary reform. And that, so far, has been lacking, completely lacking, I have to say. The idea that the SDR can somehow replace the dollar is a red herring. In fact, I think it was quite deliberately a red herring, proposed probably by the Chinese to see if there would be any reaction, in the knowledge that if the US said no to I'm talking now about the $250 billion SDR issue, I see that very much, which I describe in the book, as, and I'm purely speculating, I see that as a proposal they expected to be turned down, such that if there was a problem later on, they could at least defend themselves as, well, we proposed something and it was turned down. And I think for that reason it was then accepted, so that they didn't have that excuse. So, but to read into that issue as you know, the potential for the SDR to become much bigger, I think would be wrong. Mm. I think we are likely to see, as you say, a move to a multi-currency system. I think that doesn't actually need coordination. What it requires is leadership, and that leadership, you know, we look to China for that. I see countries as selling their US dollars over time because they don't want to be the country left holding the baby. They don't want to be held holding predominantly dollars if the dollar's going down eventually. And with those dollars, moving their reserves into their export competitors to keep their export competitors' currencies strong. Mm-hmm. So I see more and more, not just swap lines, but as we're also starting to see, you know, a cross-buying of reserves in emerging markets. And that, by itself, creates liquidity and stability in those currencies over time. You know, I also talk a lot about liquidity. Liquidity is the thing that, the sort of one of the final refuges of the arguments of central bankers saying we can't possibly move. But liquidity in the US dollar is, of course, not really analysed correctly. I think I have a theory about liquidity. You know, Keynes talked about liquidity. Mm-hmm. We've forgotten much of what he says. You need supply and demand. And the fact that something has been liquid is no guarantee that it's going to be liquid. In fact, what we see is that when liquidity falls, it tends to fall massively, and it's always, you know, down. And where I think the error in thinking about this is what I try to do is say, well, there are three things which may cause a sudden liquidity problem. One, when you've got a homogeneous investor base. And that's unfortunately what we have, because central banks are very dominant in certainly overseas holdings of US treasuries now. And because they think alike and because they are homogeneous, that in itself is a risk. You combine that with leverage at the economic level, at the economy level at least, if not in the instrument, and with a misperception of risk, namely the idea that US treasuries are risk-free, and I think you have a potential problem. So this is an environment where I see the emerging market central banks as being absolutely crucial to, if you like, reducing the pressure over time by buying each other's currencies. And an alternative problem being one of sudden change and suddenly coming out of the dollar.
Jérôme, one final question. You know, we talk about prejudice in emerging markets. We talk about the need to reform the international financial architecture. We talk about the unwinding of US monetary policy. Mm-hmm. We talk the fragile five. What is your scenario moving forward? Do you think that emerging market will be able to play a strong leadership role in the next decade? And remember that one of the major discussions has been that the next managing director of the IMF should be coming from not only from the US or Europe anymore, but you know, it should be an open process based on qualification. Yes. Do you see someone like Agustin Carstens or Raghu Rajan maybe coming as the next managing director of the IMF, and that maybe will change also the way we think about the maintenance institutions?
Well, you know, I was very disappointed that Agustin didn't get the job this time round, and whether that will change or not. You asked me for my crystal ball. You know, I'm very wary of that. We can't predict the future. We don't know. I think the best we can do is prepare ourselves for lots of different scenarios, and I think that's one of the messages of my book for investors and policymakers, really to think. For me, scenario planning is a very real, real-time
and taking into account, as you said, macro politics, history.
And we need to get macroeconomics back into asset allocation, which is it's a very primitive science at the moment, and it's just ignored lots of things. It's taking the view that if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. You know, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, and this whole concept of risk is poorly done. But I think, coming back to your question about the IMF, I hope that, because I have great respect, certainly for the people in the IMF, and I think it's got this fantastic history and role. And I'm loath to criticise the fund. I think it does need to have strong emerging market leadership and participation if it's really going to fulfil its potential. And the sooner it does that, the better. And if it doesn't, then I think there will be competitor institutions. I think for the development banks, the problem in a way is more acute in the sense that I think the development banks should be getting back to infrastructure financing. I think that's what they're good at, that's what they should be doing.
That's right.
You know, I worked for some years at the Inter-American Development Bank, and I felt that it had drifted. It's certainly been drifting, as have all the institutions, as it went more towards policy lending, etc. Really, from what really needs to be done, which is still infrastructure, because infrastructure does have public good characteristics. There is a requirement, you know, which the private sector on its own is unlikely to meet in all circumstances. And I think we now live in a world very different to when I started in Washington, where, you know, private capital really is available in scale to provide a lot of the other financing. And I think that combined with the need that these institutions are once again perceived very much in a way that the IDB has been very good at compared with some of them, very much owned by the borrowing countries. And I think I have great affection for the IDB because it always has been that. And I think that in a way is where development financing, development banking has to go. And the International Monetary, you know, Fund, I think really will, for me, the test will be whether it can achieve leadership in the reform of the international monetary system.
On that note, Jerome, thank you very much for being with us today. And again, Emerging Market in an Upside Down World by Jerome Booth. Thank you.